Hello, everyone, and welcome to Get Hired Live. I'm your host, Brandy Fowler, and I'm coming to you live from the LinkedIn office in Atlanta. Before we get started, as we always do, make sure you hit the comments, tell us about where you're from, about your career. This is a great time to network with each other. And if you have any questions as we talk today, make sure you drop those in the comments so we can get those answered for you. Okay, we have a great show for you today. My colleague Andrew Steeman talked last week on his Get Hired podcast about how to create a presence that will get you hired. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that today. He talked to Lorraine Lee, who is the founder of Rise Solutions, and Lorraine is here with us today too. Lorraine, thank you so much for joining.
Of course, I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. And one of the things that you and Andrew talked about was how essential it is to build your professional presence. But before we get into how to do that, can you talk about the definition of it? How would you define it?
Yeah, that's such a great question because I think presence can feel like a very intangible thing to a lot of people. So I define it as how you come across to others and where others come across you. So it's the intersection of those two things.
Absolutely. And now that we know what it is, can you talk about the elements of professional presence that you should start building first? Like, what's a good way to get started?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, it can kind of feel a little bit like an intangible thing. So I created a framework called the RAVE model, which I was really excited about to kind of help people, figure out how they can build their presence in tangible ways. So RAVE stands for relationships, appearances, visibility, and expertise. And these are all the really important things that go into your presence. In terms of what I would say maybe is the most important one, maybe you would want to focus on appearances first, just because first impressions make such a difference, and people make first impressions in as little as a few milliseconds. So appearances is going to be really important. But I think these are all they all kind of go hand in hand and build on one another. So for example, if you have strong relationships, that may be more helpful in helping you land a new job, or if you're already in a job, that might be key to helping you get a new project.
I love that. Those are great building blocks. But as we've seen too, like some people walk in the room and they just have like this it factor. There's something about them that commands presence. But if you feel like you don't have your it factor or you don't have that confidence when you walk into a room, what can you do to start working on that? And actually, just to go back a little, how
Yeah.
can you find that? Like, how can you find out what your it factor is?
Yeah, so totally agree with you. I feel like we've all gone into networking events or just been at the office or even virtually where someone, shows up on screen, shows up in the room and you're like, wow, they're so magnetic. Like what is it about them? I'm just drawn to them. But again, I like to say like that's why I created the rave model. It's not like one specific magical thing about them. It's a lot of little things they do that add up. So, for example, they hold eye contact really well, they're smiling, they're using your name, they are bringing attention to you instead of themselves. So, it's really about being cognizant of all of these things that go into it and working on those things because these are skills, believe it or not. It's not just like you show up one day and some people are charismatic and have presence and some people don't. And I would say, really, when you're starting off, I think people, maybe sometimes try to emulate others they see, but I think just figuring out kind of what makes you special, like being genuine and not trying to be someone else, and figuring out what's authentic to you when it comes to those various skills, like, smiling and how you just build relationships with people. I think that's how you get started. And to not freak yourself out trying to be, like a certain way and just again, like be your authentic self. I think especially in this day and age, like we all really appreciate authenticity and being genuine. And through the pandemic, that really came out in a lot of us. So just leaning into that and being okay with that.
I love that. And then also, you and Andrew talked about so it's not just the it factor when you walk into the room, it's also about like when you're building your presence like virtually too. And you talked about just how important it is for job seekers to build their virtual presence as well. How can you do that in a way that makes people like take note of you, like to
Yeah.
recognize you?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked that because it seems like I've been hearing more and more people say, "Oh, we don't need to practice, video skills anymore. We know it after years of remote working," or "We don't need it because we're going back to the office or we're going hybrid." But the reality is that video is such a huge differentiating factor, and if you can, kind of excel with your virtual presence, that really helps you stand out. And so I still get, I don't know about you, Brandy, but I still get on many calls where the person just hasn't worked on their virtual presence at all. It definitely makes a difference in how I view, how professional they seem or how credible they seem. So A few key areas I would focus on first that are like really foundational to a virtual presence is your framing, eye contact, lighting, and curating your environment on camera.
Awesome. And I want to just take a moment, excuse me, to say hello to some people in the comments. Got
Yes.
tongue-tied for a second. Hello, Yolanda from Texas, Martin from Hungary, Nahid from Rochester, Charles from Hong Kong. Wow, Eva from
Oh,
Belgium,
international.
Catherine from New York City. Everybody's from everywhere. And also, I want to just remind you, for everybody that's chiming in, make sure you drop those questions in because I want to make sure that Lorraine answers those for you. Wonderful. And so also wanted to just talk about too on the virtual tip, when you're going to a virtual networking event, how do you show your presence in that way too? Because there are a lot of times you're on a Zoom, there's a lot of people, but how do you kind of command attention in that way?
Yeah, so I talked about kind of those like basic foundational things you should set up, like making sure you have the right framing, you know, how to have eye contact on camera, things like that. But I would also use it as a time to show yourself as a leader. So when I talk about meetings, and this applies to networking events virtually as well, talking about rules of engagement and how you want people to show up, how you want them to participate. So I'm sure we've all been to meetings or happy hours or networking events where you show up and there's no rules. It's just like, oh, some people are raising their hand with the emoji, some people are just unmuting and speaking up, and it's kind of chaotic. And especially if you're an introvert, it's just extremely overwhelming. And so being able to, if you're the facilitator, making it very clear how you want people to participate and creating some structure around that is very helpful. And I think, virtual often gets overwhelming because there isn't that structure built in. But whether you're a participant, whether you're leading it, like being able to ask the facilitator ahead of time, hey, have you thought about these things? I think that goes a long way in helping people be able to feel comfortable participating, again, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, and also gives you that opportunity to really shine, to show that you know how to kind of lead these sorts of events.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, when you're talking about extrovert versus introvert, there can be times if you're introverted, whether it's
Yeah.
like virtual or really in person, where you can just feel awkward, especially like post 2020. Like it just kind of feels awkward sometimes to be in
Yeah.
social settings for people who laid low during that time. So what can you do to work on that if you have an awkwardness or a shyness about you and you still want to, show your presence?
Yeah, I think take it slow and start small. So, I mean, to your point, like I hear even extroverts saying, when they go to networking events, they feel awkward, and it's like, oh my gosh, like what are introverts feeling if you as an extrovert feel awkward? And so I think not putting too much pressure on yourself and just understanding that we all have to kind of ease back into things. And so, as an introvert, I might start off, not just showing up to an in-person networking event, but maybe you take a few one-on-one video calls to start, or you look at the attendee list ahead of time and you see, okay, this person is going to be there. Let me send them a message ahead of time and let them know that I would like to talk to them and to meet them. And that makes it a little bit easier as well when you approach them in person, if you end up going in person. And I think, just again, remembering like it's just about getting to know people, and you don't need to put on some sort of big show. And just the power of introverts is that they are very good at listening and genuinely getting to know people and asking questions. So just knowing that that's your superpower and you're gonna make a great impression to these people, I think is important to remember as well.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. And I want to take a
Mhm.
moment to say hi to some people in the comments that are chiming in. A lot of people are saying
Yeah.
hello to Khalid from Atlanta, Anthony from Los Angeles, Sean from Toronto, Madeline from Singapore, Percy from South Africa, Linda from Florida. We really do have people from everywhere today. This is awesome. And then Lorraine, a few members in the comments are asking us to review the model that you shared earlier. Can we go back to that for a second? Can you
Sure.
talk again about that, the model you shared?
Yeah. So it's called the RAVE model, and RAVE stands for relationships, appearances, visibility, and expertise. And so there's a lot of different things that kind of, go within each section. But I'll give you just some examples. Like relationships is about, how you connect with people. So, using people's first names, for example, goes a long way in helping people feel connected to you. Turning off autopilot when you jump on a call, for example, and not just autopilot, like, how are you? I'm good. How are you? I'm good. But trying to really get deeper and getting to know someone. Appearances, for example, how you appear on camera or in person. And so I talked about this earlier, but like things like framing and eye contact and all that. Visibility, not to be confused with appearances. So visibility is more where you appear. So are you appearing in the right channels amongst leadership? Are you promoting your work to groups, to senior decision makers, people who are important and who are going to be able to help you grow your career? And for expertise, I talk a lot about leveraging LinkedIn and making sure that you have a voice outside the office as well, because when you can do that, it actually does strengthen your presence, your influence, your reputation within the office as well.
When you talked about leveraging LinkedIn, that's actually the next question I was going to talk to
Oh,
you.
okay, perfect.
I want to go back to how to leverage your social media
Yeah.
to build and develop your professional presence. And can you offer just a couple of your top tips on how to do that?
Yeah. So I just want to reiterate again, like I mean, I worked at LinkedIn, but not just because of that. Like, I love LinkedIn. It's helped my career so much. And I feel like when anytime I joined a new company, they saw my LinkedIn presence. It was, a great thing. It made me look more credible. They were impressed. They wanted me even more as a job candidate. So I hope that I encourage all of you to give it a try if you're not posting yet on LinkedIn. Three simple things I would recommend that everyone can do after this talk with Brandy today. The first thing would be to turn on something called creator mode. So if you scroll down your profile, kind of like midway, there will be a button that says turn on creator mode. And so doing that makes your profile more discoverable. It allows you to indicate kind of 5 hashtags, 5 areas of expertise that you speak on. And it also restructures your profile in a certain way. So it highlights more like rich media and content you've created and a few other benefits, but definitely turn that on. I would also make sure to comment on other people's posts. So if you're kind of nervous to make that first post under your name, commenting on other people's posts is a really great way to get comfortable with that, to also build your visibility and to also meet new people, new interesting people who, are interested in the same topics that you are. And the last thing I would say is just make sure your profile is up to date. So you could get all the basics, headline, experience section, etc. But there's also a lot of other really cool features that people are not taking advantage of. So you might want to add a video cover story, for example. Make sure you have a really nice background photo. Update your headline so it's not just job title at company, but you talk a little bit more about what you do at the job or what you're passionate about. So making all these little adjustments have a really big impact later on.
Great tips. Thank you for that. And then also,
Mhm.
as you're building your virtual presence, it's also key to know how people are perceiving you. Um,
Yeah.
Andrew talked a lot about that too, which I loved. Can you talk about how to find out how you're being perceived and how you're moving in the right direction for your career? You should talk to your network, but what questions should you ask them to make sure that you're on the right track?
Yeah, so Andrew and I had a really good conversation about the importance of feedback. So I like to call it finding your feedback circle. And so yeah, there's various questions you can ask them. And what I like to say is, whatever you decide to ask your feedback circle, just make sure that the questions are specific. So not just like, what do you think of what you're seeing here? But share some of the goals, that you're working on, what you're trying to achieve. So you might ask questions like, if you're talking about your LinkedIn, like who else do I remind you of and why? So you can kind of get a sense in terms of your presence there. Or what do you think is something I should change to get closer to, XYZ goal? I also really like using scales. So on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think my profile is achieving, this? If it's not a 5, why not? So getting really specific and I think understanding your goals is a really good first step, and then kind of framing your questions around those goals.
I love that too. And then also, once you build that presence, how do you set yourself up to get a job with it?
Yeah. So 3 things come to mind. So I touched on this earlier, but relationships are a really big part. So trying to get referrals whenever you can, those go a really long way. I don't know the exact stat, but most jobs are filled through referrals. So if you have a second degree connection, if you have a first degree connection, but you're kind of hesitant to reach out, I would just really encourage you to try to push past that discomfort. And I think just remembering, like, writing a nice, genuine note about why you're reaching out, giving them an out if they feel uncomfortable, but just saying, you're looking for a job. This is what you think you can bring to it. Can you refer me? I think most people are happy to refer you, and usually they get a referral bonus. So I think people are happy to do that if you get hired. The second thing I would say is make your LinkedIn profile public. So this is something that I think is like a less popular thing that, or less known thing that people do. But ever since I've had my LinkedIn, I've made it public because I just don't want to create any friction points. If a recruiter comes to my page and they only see half of my experience, or they see, one thing that kind of intrigues them, but then they have to, send a request and have you accept them and all that, that just adds a lot of unnecessary friction for them to really find out who you are as an amazing professional. So leave it public. You become more discoverable. More people can find you, can learn about you, can save your profile for later if it's not quite the right fit now. But I think having your profile public has a lot of benefits. And then the third thing I would say is try recording a video to send to hiring managers and recruiters. So we talked earlier about the importance of your virtual presence and your virtual setup. So once you get this right, to be able to send a video and introduce yourself, and so the recruiter can see your face and hear your voice and see your body language and all of that, that will go a long way in helping you differentiate yourself and also, create a really strong impression for them.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get to
Yeah.
some member questions really quickly. Before the show, Dorothy asked, what recommendations do you have for people with unseen disabilities when it comes to building a presence? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember this question from Dorothy. Yeah. I would say being really upfront about them. So if you are on a call with a recruiter and you can't turn on your video for whatever reason, don't just, brush that under the rug. I think being able to explain and just share why, will help people understand and not make assumptions that are incorrect, like, oh, she is unfriendly, or oh, she I don't know what people might assume, like when you don't have your video on, or oh, I don't feel as connected to her, or I'm not going to feel as connected to her with her video off, so I'm just going to kind of discount that interview. So I think being explicit and stating up front, and again, like I talked earlier about how with COVID, like we all got to be more of our authentic and genuine selves, and so I think sharing that and trying to be as vulnerable as you can, within your comfort zone, will help with that.
I absolutely agree with that. That's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. And then Nancy asked tips for working moms on building their presence after a career break, which is something I think a lot of people deal with. Great question.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to, I don't know if you're feeling this way, but I know sometimes people can feel self-conscious after a career break. But I think LinkedIn now has this really cool feature where you can actually input a career break as an actual kind of like a job on your experience section. So adding that in there and maybe a few lines for why you had that career break is a good thing to think about first. But I would say all the rules that I shared earlier still apply to new moms, working moms, like, and I think it actually even can help, like you can share more about yourself. Like I see a lot of parents and moms putting in their about section about the fact that they are parents. And I've seen a mom talk about, I mean, her whole job is built around like helping other working moms excel at work. And so I think just leaning into it, and I don't know if you were feeling hesitant to put it in at all, but just making that part of your story will help people connect better with you. And again, you can still grow your presence in all the other ways that I mentioned earlier.
I love that. I love that. And then Jason asked, what's your advice on demonstrating a presence when completing a phone screening? He said he deals with that a lot in tech.
So like, I think the question's around like presence on phone calls. Is that
After completing a phone screening, it says.
okay? Well, I guess I'll just address quickly both sides. So I think when you're on the phone, acting like you're in person helps. So stand up, that gives you more energy. Smile, that comes across differently in your voice. So that would be like once you're on the phone. After the phone, I think it will be similar to like any interview. So you'll want to send a thank you note. You'll want to send any follow-up materials. You'll want to, when you send that follow-up note, touch on specific things that you spoke on. Maybe you send a video thank you note, which I talked about earlier. So I think all these things about building presence totally still apply, even if your first call is on the phone.
Awesome. And then we have two more questions that are kind of related. Kelsey asks, what are your tips and tricks for engaging your interviewer as soon as you walk in the door? I love that. That's so important.
So this sounds like maybe it's in person, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I know we're all over the place, but yeah, this
I
is
know we have to like specify.
yeah.
So in person, I think, strong handshake if they feel comfortable with a handshake. The eye contact is really important. So the reason that humans both like to shake hands and make eye contact in person is that the skin to skin contact with the hands touching and then the eye contact release something called oxytocin. And oxytocin is known as a social bonding hormone. So when you do those things, you connect better with that person. Another thing I would say, I touched on this earlier, applies to both virtual and in person, but turning off that autopilot. So yes, you might start off, a typical meeting with how are you, but try to get a little bit deeper than that. Either share something about yourself, ask them some sort of interesting question that sort of breaks up the monotony that they might normally, feel, or kind of the typical thing they might feel or hear on these interviews or meetings. And I think that's a really good way to stand out and also to build a connection very quickly at the start.
Awesome. And then also, Sandra asked, how do you make yourself stand out in front of recruiters?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things you can do. So I talked about having a complete LinkedIn profile. I think that video message is going to be really key. And then I think posting like that thought leadership piece as well on LinkedIn is really important. And I just want to actually kind of clarify or emphasize something. I think a lot of people get freaked out sometimes when people talk about thought leadership or content on LinkedIn. It means that they need to be a content creator or they need to become like an influencer, but really it's just about like think about what you're passionate about and what you can talk about and just talk about those things. So don't get intimidated or overwhelmed by kind of that other side of it. I think just sharing and just wanting to help people is going to be how you should approach sharing content on LinkedIn. And then I think there's a bunch of other, smaller things that kind of add up. So the thank you note, I can't remember if I mentioned that before. And just being really specific about how you think you can contribute, how you think you can help the team. I think there's a lot of candidates out on the market now, and so the more specific you can get, I think will really help you stand out.
That is so helpful because I think a lot of times when people are trying to create content, they can get caught up in a lot of those things and just
Yeah.
that, keeping it simple and talking about what you love is such a helpful tip. So thank you for
Mhm.
that. And then I have one more member question too that I think everyone can relate to. And Tina says, my confidence takes a hit during interviews if I trip over my words or don't know how to answer a question. Absolutely.
Yeah.
How can I avoid this from happening?
Yeah, we've all been there. So I would say I'll give an example of myself. So I do these live interviews, I do podcasts, and there will be times afterwards where I'm like, oh my gosh, I completely stumbled over that part, or I feel like I came across, a way I didn't want to come across at that moment. And then I will listen to myself afterwards and be like, oh, actually, I sound okay. And so that's just me saying that we're all our own worst critics. And so that if you stumble over something you say, you are probably the only one who notices it. And, maybe reframe it this way. When you stumble, it feels a little bit more, maybe like more natural, more genuine, a little bit less rehearsed. It doesn't have to be like 100% perfect. You're a real person and we all stumble over our words. And so just remember that we're all our own worst critics.
I love that. And I can't believe our time has already come to an end. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for all of the tips.
Oh,
This was incredible. And I hope everyone was taking notes because it was great. Thank you.
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to all of you for joining as well. As you know, we always are trying to create content to help you with your career. And this week on the Get Hired podcast, Andrew sat down with Tiffany Uman, who is a career strategy coach. They talked about how to answer common interview questions. You can check out the episode wherever you listen to podcasts when it's live on Wednesday, April 19th. And thank you again so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of it. And I will see you soon. Have a great week.